A little luxurious, a little smart, and really fast. Apparently, that's how you sell a Zeekr 7X Performance. Now, in terms of the powertrain, the Zeekr 7X comes with no less than 2 battery options. You can either get a 75 kilowatt hour LFP battery in the base model, or for the rear-wheel drive long range, and this, the 7X Performance, you get a 100 kilowatt hour NMC battery. Now that gives the long range about 615 kilometers WLTP, whereas on this performance model that drops to about 543 kilometers. However, in terms of charging, Zeekr has not cheaped out, because for the 100 kilowatt models, or 100 kilowatt hour models rather, you get 22 kilowatt AC charging as standard, which means that charging this car from dead to full takes about 5 hours or less than 5 hours. But in terms of DC charging, these NMC batteries will accept up to 420 kilowatt DC, which means that this car can charge from 10 to 80% when the charge flap wants to stay open at a ridiculous speed, which means that if you are taking even your performance 7X over a longer distance, stopping wouldn't have to require too much of a lay-by. But of course, you may be wondering, why would you get the performance over the rear-wheel drive long range? Which is a question that I've been asking. But this car will go from 0 to 100 in well under 4 seconds, which is perhaps why some people might consider this. The slightly more practical might consider the 7X Performance on the basis that it offers all-wheel drive, whereas the rear-wheel drive long range is, as the name suggests, rear-wheel drive. Now, in terms of exterior goodies, the Zeekr 7X lineup does look broadly similar, but this performance model, being the top of the range model, has a few goodies. So for example, only the 7X Performance gets the Stargate LED light curtain up here, which you can customize to your heart's content, which means that you can have different daytime running light signatures, you can have different signatures when the car locks and unlocks, which means that there are many ways for you to utilize this LED light curtain that goes all the way across. Also, only the Performance gets the Zeekr badge here, which is illuminated, because if you do not get a model with the Stargate LED headlights, this moves up here, and then this area just becomes completely blacked out. So that's certainly one way to tell whether or not somebody has spent all the dosh on the more expensive model. That said, however, the full LED headlights that live down here, that is standard, and in our market these come with automatic high beam. However, in left-hand drive markets, these are actually LED matrix headlights, so I find that a bit odd. But the daytime running light, the main daytime running light, lives down here along with your scrolling indicator, which means that again, if you do not get the performance model, all your lighting just lives here. Up here does absolutely nothing. Now, moving further down, you get a set of active aero flaps here, which open and close depending on whether or not the car needs to cool. But aside from that, there are no other aerodynamic trickery going on down here. Instead, it's a nice flat flush front end with only very small air breathers here in the corner in order to help smooth air over the front wheels. Now, one of the things I would like to point out about the Zeekr 7X that I appreciate enormously is the fact that there is a button on the key that allows you to pop the bonnet, which means that when you do open this space here, which doesn't have an additional latch, you can actually make full use of this car's front boot. Now, because this is the all-wheel drive model, naturally there isn't that much space in here, but it is still big enough to hold like a granny charger, for example, should you need a little bit of space, or should you want to carry that in case of emergencies. But again, the fact that you can access this from the key means that this space is far more usable than a lot of other cars that offer space in the bonnet but require you to go into the car to open it. I also appreciate the fact that in order to open this, you have to press the button twice, which means that there is no need for an additional latch here, which again makes this space far more accessible and therefore far more usable. Now, the Zeekr 7X Performance offers in excess of 630 PS and over 700 Newton meters of torque, which means that it's very important that rolling stock in this car is of adequate performance, which is why this car comes with 20-inch alloy wheels wrapped in Michelin Pilot Sport EV tires, which are excellent and are great for this application because it means that the car never really scrabbles for grip, particularly given the fact that this car is well north of 2 tons in weight. Because of that weight, that's also necessitated very good brakes for this car, which is why, as you can see, there are orange brake calipers front and rear, because the 7X Performance uses Akebono brakes with 6-piston calipers up front in order to stop this car as quickly as necessary, which I think is very reassuring given the fact this car is incredibly fast. Now, moving further down the side, one of the things I appreciate is the fact that this black panel here, where you find the Stargate, actually continues visually onto this panel here, which gives it a very interesting effect over the wheel arches. The wheel arches themselves are not flared, but because of this visual effect, it makes it look like it's pushing out of the bodywork, which I think is quite interesting. The other thing that I find quite interesting is the fact this car comes with an array of cameras. So you have one here and two more here, not just for the 360-degree camera, but also for this car's active safety features, which utilizes cameras exclusively in order to read the world around it. Now, moving further down the side, you have a set of functional roof rails up here, although why you use them is beyond me. And as you move further to the rear, you can see that they have this very minimalist design language, which again makes this car seem a lot cleaner, a lot neater, a lot easier to use. However, there are a couple of things about the side profile that I like and don't like. What I appreciate is the fact that this car comes with frameless windows, which means that this car does look quite interesting when the doors are open. However, one of the features I've come to deeply dislike is this car's automatic doors. Now, this sort of feature is something that will wow you when you are in a showroom, when a sales advisor is trying to sell you the car, because you think, oh look, this car comes with fancy features like a Rolls-Royce or a BMW i7. The only problem is, in practical usage, they are quite irritating, because imagine for a moment that you have arrived at your car and you've got your hands full and you want to get in the car and it's raining. Now, let's imagine that there's a car parked next to you. So you press the button and then the car will stop about here. It likes to leave a gap of about that far between it and whatever it is that's next to it, be it a pillar or another car or whatever. So now the door's only open this big, so now you have to pull it that way. And once you get back in the car, yes, you can press the brake and the driver's door will close. But it doesn't do so very quickly, which means that while you're sitting there waiting for your door to close, now everything on your door card is getting wet, including whatever it is that you have in the space down there, as well as all your buttons, while you're waiting for this door to very leisurely close. That has been surprisingly annoying. And a friend of mine who actually has one of these said that the reason why he didn't buy the Performance was specifically because of the doors, because he thought that this is something that's going to be very irritating over time. And although I haven't been caught short in the rain, I can understand why. Now, at the back of the Zeekr 7X, I do think this design does look quite good. Because of this car's relatively long roof and this interesting profile, it does actually make this car look a little bit more like an estate rather than an SUV. This also helps when the car gets into its lowest air suspension setting, which I will touch on a little bit later. But at the rear, the design is relatively clean, because while you have lots of complex surfacing, the design elements themselves are very neat. So you have a single LED light bar here, which is only bisected by this middle mounted camera. The rear windscreen wiper is mounted here in the spoiler in order to give this car a very clean rear end, although this car obviously is not very clean. And because this light bar lifts with the tailgate, that's necessitated a second set of lights down here. However, unlike an Xpeng G6, all the major light functions live here until the tailgate is open, because LED technology has advanced to the point where we can have LEDs that do multiple things. Xpeng. Now, as you see further down here, there is a little bit of black plastic here to give this car a sort of off-roadery look. And I will give Zeekr some credit, because they have actually taken the 7X off-road here in Malaysia in order to prove this car's capability off the beaten track. So this is not just a pretty mall crawler. This car can actually do some proper off-road duty if need be. Not that anybody's doing that. Now, behind this very manky tailgate, you can see the tail lights popping on down there, you will find a pretty good amount of space. Now again, the Zeekr 7X is broadly about the same size as an Xpeng G6 and other vehicles in that space, the BYD Sealion 7, etc. Which means that in terms of practicality, this is a very important aspect for a lot of customers, because a lot of people are buying these as family cars. Now, if you have 5 people within the car, there is plenty of space in here for all of their flotsam. That is not an issue whatsoever. In addition to this space rather, there is space underneath the boot floor here, which you can just lift off in its own separate space, and you will find a pretty good and very deep well underneath the floor, which means that you can put all of your charging cables in here without any issue whatsoever. But Zeekr makes this a little bit better by adding an additional space behind that, which means that you have even more space. It's a bit shallower, but in order to hide even more items back there, things like, for example, dirty shoes, etc., you can hide them underneath the floor altogether. And of course, if you need even more space, you can fold the rear seats flat 60-40 in order to create an absolutely cavernous amount of room in here. In addition to that, you also have lights, you have hooks, as well as a 12-volt power socket outlet with a cover that looks suspiciously like the ones you get on a Proton. Now, in addition to all of this, the Zeekr 7X also has a party piece if you buy the Performance model, which allows you to lower the rear end in order to improve ingress and egress into the boot. This is particularly helpful if you have very large, very heavy items in order to reduce this load lip, or if you have a very old dog, for example, so then they don't have to jump up so high. In addition to that, the load lip on this car is also very small, which means that that also benefits not only human beings taking things in and out, but also small animals trying to get in and out because they don't have to jump over a great distance. This is all very thoughtful and very smart indeed. And as far as I'm concerned, I think the Zeekr 7X does a pretty good job as a family car. The only problem is the model that we have here does not come with a parcel shelf. Even though there are fittings for them, it didn't come with it. Now, I'm not sure if they're delivered without it, but if they are, and you are looking to buy one of these, I insist that you press your sales advisor in order to include one, because otherwise everything that you have back here will be on full display to entrepreneuring thieves. Now, the interior of the Zeekr 7X is very stylish, but not stylish enough to have a sunglasses holder, so I just have to... Now, the interior of this car certainly has that very minimalist feel that you get from a lot of Chinese vehicles, where you have only a single row of buttons here, which are decently useful, but that's about it, which means that everything in this car is controlled via this massive touch screen. Now, mercifully, this massive touchscreen is very responsive with very good rendering in terms of its ability to move the car around, etc. I'm not entirely sure why it's not letting me... Hang on. Because I'm normally allowed to spin this around, but I guess not right now. But in any case, the graphics on this are pretty good, and the interface overall is not that bad. So even when you go into, for example, the car settings, it's all set up in a relatively easy to use manner. Although I would appreciate it if this menu was moved here, because that would have been a lot easier for me to utilize instead of having to reach all the way to the other end of the screen. But otherwise, like I said, the settings and the user interface for this is all decently good. This is what you've come to expect from a vehicle like this, and so there is nothing here that's going to surprise you, and overall it does work decently well. One of the things I appreciate is the fact there's actually this little sidebar here, which allows you to control various functions, and you can actually edit what functions are available through that sidebar, which means that you can always add or retract things that are available here and move them around based on what it is that you use most often. Now, beyond that, I also appreciate the fact that this system, because it's very responsive, it allows you to adjust the air conditioning vents very quickly, which is what you need because you need to use the screen to adjust the air conditioning vents. So that means that, for example, if I want to adjust this, I have to move this around like that in order to get the thing sort of working like that. And as you can see, this only allows for horizontal adjustment. I can only move this left and right. I can't move this up and down, which means that if my face happened to be, let's say, here, then I'm screwed. So thankfully I am the national average, but at least you do have the option to have it on a free thing or a sweep or a focus or whatever it is that you might prefer. And of course you can adjust the rear air conditioning from here as well, where you can adjust the temperature, but mercifully the B-pillar mounted air conditioning vents are manual, which means that your rear seat passengers shouldn't have to deal with this problem at all. The other thing that I'd like to point out is the fact that because the screen is so responsive, it also means that adjusting the side mirrors are also a little bit easier, because again, that has to be done through the screen. All of these functions are done through here, which I just find really, really annoying, including things like adjusting the heads-up display. That's fine because you don't have to do that very often, but even the steering wheel adjustment is done through the screen, which means that once again you have to trigger that first before these buttons actually do anything, which I just find really annoying. Why couldn't you have just put a button here on the column like everybody else? But anyway, beyond that, at the very least, because this is pretty functional, you're not going to be too pissed off at it all the time. And more importantly, this does allow for things like memory seat adjustment, which means that once you set everything in here, it's quite easy to restore those adjustments, which include adjusting the mirrors as well as the seat and the steering wheel, which means that at least you won't have to manipulate this all that often. What I also appreciate is the fact that there is this instrument cluster display here, which in terms of its operation and overall usability actually feels very similar to what you get from a Proton EMA 7. In terms of the layouts and the displays and all that, it's almost identical in terms of its interface. The only difference is that this is like an instrument cluster sized and shaped display as opposed to a simple square screen that they've tacked on. And so I appreciate the attention to detail, but the additional real estate hasn't really been fully utilized, and so this just looks like something that's been put here for vanity, not really for functionality. Mercifully, however, there is a full color heads-up display up ahead of me, which also shows me this car's ADAS functions and this and that and the other, which means that for the most part you don't really look here. Everything that you need to see is up there, including things like your adaptive cruise control, speed settings, etc. It all comes out on the heads-up display, which means that this instrument cluster is kind of not really necessary. So whatever issues that you have here are not really going to be that big of a deal. Now, in terms of practicality, you have a couple of wireless charging pads here, a relatively large storage space underneath, replete with 2 USB-C ports. You have a couple of cup holders here, which are deployable, which means that you can have this as either a large space or you can deploy this to have a couple of cup holders. You press this button and then you get this car's felt-lined glove box, which is always nice to see. It's not very deep and it's not very tall, which means that you have to be very careful with the things that you put in here, but at least whatever you do put in here will not rattle about. The same goes for the door bins, which are decently large, and there is a little bit of felt lining and rubber lining on the bottom, which means that it's not going to rattle. If you put small items in here, it's not going to rattle, so that's nice. And overall, it does feel quite good. However, then you come to this center console box here, where you can open it from either side, which means that you have a better amount of flexibility and accessibility between your two front passengers. However, this box is actually meant to be removed, and that's because you can actually buy an optional fridge to fit in here, which means that you can actually remove this and take it out altogether. The problem with this removable modular storage space is that even once it's locked in place, it's not particularly well fitting. So even with this lid closed, it still rocks about quite a bit. So for example, if you're on Belgian pave, this will rattle. If you lean on it, it will rattle. That is not great, particularly given the fact the rest of this cabin is so very well screwed together that this just feels like a really strange omission. Anyway, beyond that, you also have this car's overall ergonomics. Now, as I'm sat here, this steering wheel doesn't come out as much as I'd like, because I would have preferred this to be about 2 or 3 centimeters closer to me, but I can still sit here quite comfortably. And more importantly, the seats on this performance model are wrapped in Nappa leather, which means it's nice and soft, and they are heated and ventilated, which means that you can sit here quite comfortably. You also get massage seats for the 2 front pews, which means that life in here is pretty good. The other thing that I do quite appreciate is the fact that as I'm sat here with the steering wheel set up in my driving position, I can still reach sort of about 3/4 of the way of this screen, which means that, for example, if I need to make slight adjustments, I can still do that while the car is moving. That I appreciate enormously. Although, again, the overall sensation that I get in here is that this is a very upmarket cabin. For a car that starts at about 180,000 ringgit, and for this performance model comes up to about 230, if I'm not mistaken. This cabin really does punch above its weight. If you were to compare this to, say, luxury cars like Mercedes-Benzes or BMWs at this price point, you're definitely getting a lot nicer material, lots of soft touch material everywhere, with real stitching as well as real metal covers for this car's premium audio system, which again just feels like a more upmarket place to be. All the buttons, all the switches here all feel very nice to use, and it all just feels very tactile. The other thing that I'd like to point out, or 2 other things I'd like to point out, is this car's ambient lighting system is fabulous. So you have these panels that go from the doors all the way across the dash, all the way to the passenger door, and you can customize them with a billion different colors or whatever. But more importantly, the way they operate, because they actually shimmer off of this metal panel that lives behind it, it provides a degree of depth. And again, it just makes this cabin feel a little bit more sophisticated as opposed to just having an LED light strip. However, the sound system in this car is not so great. So in the Zeekr X, which is the smaller model, and the Zeekr 009, which is the flagship MPV, you can get a Yamaha stereo system in them, and it sounds fabulous. But in the 7X, you only get something called Zeekr Premium Sound. Now, there are speakers everywhere, including up here on the ceiling. There are tweeters up there, as well as a couple of speakers up here on the headrest. But unfortunately, they don't really work together very well. And what I found is that the sound processing in this car is a little bit lackluster, which means that when you have music that plays very deep bass, for example, it tends to clip, and it doesn't seem to really balance out the sound very well. There are a variety of different settings for you to use in here, if I find the setting for it. So for example, there are various different sound effects enhancement options available here, as well as your typical equalizer that you can set up here. But unfortunately, no matter what you do, it just doesn't sound as good as it should, which means that ultimately a Xpeng G6 still has a better sound system with its X Opera audio. But at least this car comes with a panoramic sunroof, a very large panoramic sunroof, with an operable sun blind, unlike the Xpeng G6, where you just have to hope and pray that it really does reject 99% of the UV and heat. Now, in the back half of the Zeekr 7X, life is pretty good. With the front seats are in my driving position, about 170 centimeters, I have basically S-Class levels of legroom, which is fabulous. And because this car is all electric, naturally there's a fully flat floor, which means that even if you have 3 passengers abreast back here, life is still going to be pretty good. This central seat is also not raised that far, and it is quite wide, which means that, for example, 3 adult passengers back here could be okay for like a couple of hours at a go, which means that life is, again, pretty good. Material quality is also just as good as it is in the front, with lots of soft touch materials, lots of stitching here. Everything that you feel is all soft touch. It's only sort of down here where it becomes sort of scratchy, but even then, that's only in the door bins, because even the lining around the speakers themselves are actually done up in a soft touch material. The same goes for the backs of the seats, which are also lined in upholstery, and they are stitched where you'll find a little bit of a pocket, although you will find a bit of piano black plastic on the backs of the front seats, which means that if you do have small children, for example, who might be kicking against these seats, this could end up scratching. In terms of amenities back here, life is still pretty good. Like I mentioned, I've got pockets behind the front seats. I've got decently sized door bins, big enough for a litre-sized bottle. And I've got a smaller pocket up here. On top of that, I also have access to a small cubby here on this center console bin, although for the life of me, I don't understand what that's for. And more importantly, I do have a deployable center armrest here where I have a couple of cup holders, and I can find my USB-C and USB-A ports hidden in here, which means that if you have 3 passengers, you can't charge anything. If you have 3 passengers, there's nowhere for you to put your cups. But I think that if you just have 2 rear passengers, life is still pretty good. On top of that, these seats are very comfortable. I have a very good amount of under-thigh support, as you can see, and I also have my own sun blind here, which I can deploy if I just pull the button. Only the 7X Performance get these powered sun blinds, which means that if you are getting a lower end model, you're not going to get these. But as far as I'm concerned, I do think they have been quite useful, particularly given the fact this car has a very light interior. Speaking of which, the upholstery colors in this car, you can actually get this in this sort of white and purple. I don't know how they call this purple, it looks grey to me, but you can only get that on this top end model. However, you also have the option of an all black interior if you'd prefer. But what is standard, however, is the fact that these rear seats are actually powered, which means that as you're sat here very comfortably, sat upright with a very good view out, I can also recline this seat should I want to take a nap or be a little bit more comfortable over a long distance journey, which I appreciate a lot. Furthermore, because this car has very large doors and a very long wheelbase, it does mean that, for example, fitting an ISOFIX mounted child seat in this car is not difficult at all, although they live underneath this sort of Velcro strap thing, which is perhaps a little bit more fiddly than might necessarily be expected, but it does work and it does hide when you don't need to use them. As far as I'm concerned, I do think the back end of this car is pretty nice, especially given the fact that the sun blind rolls up to a space behind my head so it doesn't impact headroom, and overall, life is pretty good. The other thing that I'd like to point out in here is the fact that if you are using this as a family car, this car also comes with something called a safety guard camera mounted on the B-pillar on the driver's side. This allows you to actually monitor the back seat from the front, which means that if your children are fighting, for example, you can actually check on them via the camera. Now, in addition to that, that also works for this car's Sentry mode, where it utilizes all the cameras on the outside as well as the camera on the inside in order to monitor the surroundings within the vehicle should you have it locked and parked. So that is something you can access via the app, if I'm not mistaken, or at the very least it's via the center console, the center infotainment system, which means that your Zeekr is always looking out for you even when you're not in the car. Now, the thing about the Zeekr 7X Performance specifically is that with this car's in excess of 600 horsepower and 700 newton meters of torque, its ability to rocket from 0 to 100 in less than 4 seconds, plus this car's adaptive air suspension with electromagnetic dampers, all of these things seem to fit or suggest that this is a performance car to drive, not just one that's fast in a straight line, but also something that should be pretty fun around the corners. However, the reality is this isn't really much of a performance car. Now, the performance numbers might suggest that this is fun to drive, especially given the fact that, again, you've got the air suspension, CDC, yada, yada, yada. But the reality is that when you're behind the wheel, this car just feels very comfortable and serene and quiet. Like, the whole point of this car is to provide a comfortable, serene driving experience, and that's it. Now, the air suspension on this car is adjustable in the sense that you can have it in comfort, normal, or sport. In comfort mode, it is very soft. It reminds me very similarly of a W220 S-Class that I used to have, in the sense that it really just irons out the very worst imperfections in the road. The car sort of lulls you along, and it is pretty comfortable. But then the moment you put it into normal mode, suddenly this car gets a little bit more fidgety. And I say fidgety because it doesn't quite have the same confidence as, say, a BMW. It just sort of moves around a lot. And then when you put it into sport, it just gets rock hard. So you can either have it in comfort, where it's too soft, or you can have it in normal, where it's suddenly a little bit too stiff. And then there's sport, which is just intolerable. So to me, I've just left it in comfort mode and just gotten along with it, because what's the point? This is clearly not a car that wants you to drive very quickly anyway. Now, in terms of the performance itself, make no mistake, 0 to 100 in 3-something odd seconds is ridiculously fast, which means that when you're driving this car along, when you're trying to merge into traffic or, trying to overtake somebody on the motorway, for example, this car makes it an absolute breeze because it's so powerful. However, there is something about the way it delivers that power which I feel is a bit odd. So when you hit the throttle in order to gain as much speed as possible, the car feels like it engages one motor first and then the other, which means that when you're accelerating, there is like this little bit of a transition, this sort of like a handover, where it goes from single motor to dual motor all-wheel drive to provide that necessary performance, which you can feel, and it feels very rough. And then once you've come off the throttle and you inevitably have to brake, because at that point you're probably doing about 120 kilometers an hour already, when you come to a stop, the car does something very similar. So as I hit the brakes, I come up to a speed bump, there is a point where it just sort of lets go, where it feels like one motor disconnects, probably for efficiency. But as it does that, again, there's sort of like a gunk as it does so, which is a bit disconcerting, especially given the fact that all of this is electronically controlled, which means that this could have been tuned to be a bit smoother, but there we are. Now, once you are done accelerating and braking to your heart's content, I suspect that most people who buy this car will probably do that flat to the floor acceleration maybe once or twice and then never do it again. The Zeekr 7X, again, just goes back to being very pleasant. The power delivery in this car when you're driving sensibly is very, very smooth. And for the most part, you can't really fault the suspension. When you drive it like this, for example, over Belgian pave, because the tires on this car are surprisingly thick, even though they're wrapped over 20-inch alloy wheels, it does mean that the worst imperfections are taken away, at least in comfort mode, but then in normal mode it comes straight back to the cabin. So pick your poison. And then once you are on the motorway, once you're done doing this sort of urban sprawl, whatever, where you'll find the controls are very light, it's relatively easy to place, and of course, because you have a 360-degree camera button on the steering wheel, even when you are stuck in slightly tighter situations, at no point does it feel too difficult to drive. But once you want to merge onto the motorway, for example, you just put your foot down, and then without too much issue at all, you are at motorway speeds, which means that in order to merge into traffic, again, it makes life very easy. Now, because this car rides on Michelin Primacy EV tires, Primacy 5 or whatever it is there might be, it means that when you are on the motorway, when you are on sealed surfaces like this, it is very, very quiet. Road noise is very, very well suppressed in this car, all the way up to the national speed limit. The same goes for wind noise. You get a little bit of buffer sort of around here and sort of around where the wing mirrors are. But aside from that, it's really not that big of a deal. And driving along in this car, as I have been for the past 6 days or so, at no point has it felt like this car is noisy. I will credit the Zeekr 7X for being a very comfortable, very quiet motorway cruiser, which is what you'd expect from a vehicle like this in the first place. And this is all achieved despite the fact that the side windows are not dual laminate glass. Instead, what Zeekr has done is they've just used very thick glass all the way around rather than dual or two pieces of thinner laminated glass. And as a result, it just means that when you're within this cabin, firstly, when the windows open and shut, there's a nice sort of thud to them. I know this is something very small, but to me it just makes it feel like, I'm sealed in, cocooned, as it were. But it also does a very good job at keeping wind noise out and keeping road noise out, as well as, for example, like passing bikes and stuff like that. They've been very well muted within the cabin, which is great. And then there is the fact that because this car is very, very powerful, it does mean that when the road is not particularly dry, you can slip, so be careful. But anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. On the motorway, this car is very comfortable, very adept cruiser. This is exactly what you want from something to cover distance. The only trouble is when you do that, the power efficiency starts to drop off a cliff. Now, when driven about in town, I've actually seen numbers on this car as low as about 15 to 16 kilowatt hours to 100, which is very impressive for something this fast or this powerful. That's the word I was looking for. Now, if you were to get the rear-wheel drive long range, which is a vehicle I have a decent amount of data on because a friend of mine bought one and has been filling me in with a lot of these details. If you were to buy the rear-wheel drive long range, again, 14, 15 kilowatt hours, 100, that's very, very achievable numbers. Whereas in this, it does take a certain degree of economical driving in order to achieve those numbers. But again, not really much of a compromise in my opinion. But when you're on the motorway, when you're doing about 110, 120 kilometers an hour, sustained over a longer period, particularly when there are not many opportunities for this car to regenerate power, it is at that point that the car's consumption will climb quite considerably. Now, I've seen numbers at about 22, 23 kilowatt hours to the 100, which means that on this 100 kilowatt hour battery, you're talking about maybe about 450 kilometers on a single charge. That's certainly not a bad thing by any measure. To be able to do 450 at speed is still very impressive. But again, if you're looking at this as something like a very long-range vehicle that will comfortably do 500, 550 kilometers on a single charge, that's not quite it, at least not when driven on the motorway. And if that is what you want to do with your 7X, and maybe get the rear-wheel drive long range instead. But ultimately, when you are on the motorway, you need to pay attention to that. The second thing you have to pay attention to if you're trying to cover distance, or in fact, even if you're just commuting to and from work, is this car's advanced driver assist features. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Zeekr 7X utilizes a vision-based ADAS system. So it utilizes a bunch of cameras, no long-range radar, so to speak. Now, the benefit of that is the car can read the world around it quite well, and because I have a heads-up display which shows me like an augmented reality view, same thing in the instrument cluster, it means that I'm quite confident in terms of understanding what the car can see, which means that I tend to trust the system a little bit more because I know whether or not it can perceive a sudden or new threat that might be in front of me. However, the thing about cameras is that they work like human eyes. If you cannot see, the camera cannot see, and vice versa. So when you are caught in particularly heavy rain, as I have been because the weather this week has been absolutely horrid, it means that the systems will eventually shut off, and then it's just you on your own navigating all of this nonsense. Now, the argument can be made that you should be driving anyway, and you're right, but it is very helpful when you have another set of eyes essentially looking around in case of things that you might miss as a driver. I know that I certainly appreciate having long-range radar when it rains, as I've seen before, or rather as I've said before, in Volvos, in BMWs, etc., because the car can actually see further than I can. But in the Zeekr 7X, much like the Xpeng G6 and other vehicles that utilize camera-based systems, you have certain limitations that you have to be aware of when you're using those systems prodigiously. And when you're using those ADAS systems in nice weather, like we're in right now, or whatever it is you want to call this, it does have some limitations. Firstly, the follow distance on this car is very, very far, much like most other Chinese vehicles. So much so that if you're caught short on the LDP, then everybody's going to cut you off. I know this because I live off the LDP, which means this is a reality for me. Secondly, when it does do that, at the very least, the car doesn't react very suddenly. So when a car cuts you off, it doesn't slam on the brakes. And then when that car disappears, it doesn't just sort of throw itself on the accelerator either. It does seem quite smooth. But the way it accelerates, on the other hand, despite the fact this car is very, very powerful, is a bit leisurely, which means that even when there is a gap in front of you and the car is accelerating, because it does so in a very leisurely pace, someone will cut you off again. It's a bit of an issue, but you can of course override this by simply putting your foot on the accelerator and the car will accelerate to wherever it is that you want to be, and then it'll take over, whatever. This is not that big of a deal. One thing that I would like to point out is the fact this car does have a driver monitoring system, much like a lot of other Chinese vehicles, but it hasn't been nearly as naggy as other vehicles. Cherry models come immediately to mind. This car hasn't told me I'm distracted 35 times in every trip, which is great, especially when you're just trying to fiddle around with the infotainment system, like trying to adjust your air conditioning vents. Now, the takeaway from all of this is the Zeekr 7X performance is a very good car. This car is very well built, it's very quiet, it's very comfortable. But there are certain issues that exist with it. So for example, the powertrain is not as efficient as you might initially want, which means that if you are driving over longer distances, you have to plan charging stops every 300 to 400 kilometers. But of course, at least when you do stop, it charges very quickly. And the ADAS system is perhaps not as polished as you might want, not as good as, for example, an Xpeng G6, where it's a lot better, especially in terms of day-to-day driving. But overall, that doesn't make this a bad car. The only deal breakers I found with the 7X performance specifically have been the doors. I cannot stand these powered doors because they are incredibly finicky to use and they're not nearly as practical as one might suggest. And the fact that they take so long to open and shut also means that, again, when you're in situations where you want the door to open and shut quickly, it just doesn't work. And when you try and do it manually, you're working against the motor, which means that to me, I just feel like these are things that might break very quickly. But aside from that, everything else in here has been relatively likable. I appreciate the way this car's been built. I would have liked some manual air conditioning vents, but it's not really a deal breaker. Said it once, leave it alone. And overall, I understand why it is the 7X has become a volume seller for Zeekr. This car is very spacious, it's very practical, and it is very refined. This is precisely the sort of thing that people are looking for within that sort of 180 to 230,000 ringgit space. And I think the Zeekr 7X really does deliver very well in that regard. However, if you want a car that's even smarter, particularly in terms of its remote abilities when you use the app and so on, and you want something with a better sound system, something with a more efficient powertrain, something that isn't pretending to be a performance car and lulling you into believing that you can throw this car around corners, then you might be better served in an Xpeng G6 all-wheel drive, because that car is about as fast, and more importantly, it runs an LFP battery, which means that if you want to charge that car to 100% every single time you plug it in, you can. The car's not going to penalize you for it, and it's not going to hurt the battery over the longer term. And that car does charge a little bit faster than this. That car does 451 kilowatt DC. This car only does 420 with the NMC battery. But of course, if you want a car within this space that is excellent to drive, and when I say this space, I mean in terms of pricing, then of course there is the Volvo EX30. Now make no mistake, the EX30 is a much smaller car. But it is about the same price as the Zeekr 7X, and more importantly, it drives brilliantly with the sort of sensibility that you expect from Volvo, plus a certain degree of driver engagement that you simply would not expect from a vehicle, number one, carrying the Volvo badge, and secondly, being all electric. But that car does do very well. But of course, if you want a nice in-between where you have some performance as well as some drivability, but you still want some space, there is of course the Smart #3, which is a car that we like quite a lot, although I will admit that the interior is not quite as nice as this 7X. But overall, I think the 7X is still a pretty decent car. It's certainly worth a look if you're shopping within this space, but I do think that there are other cars that do other things better. The Xpeng G6 is smarter. The Smart #3 is cheaper and slightly better to drive. And of course, the Volvo EX30 is a Volvo, which means that you have very Volvo luxury sensibilities as opposed to this very new age design and new age take on cabin design overall. But I wouldn't blame you for wanting one of these. I get the showroom appeal. I understand why it is that people like these things so much. I understand why it's become so popular. But Zeekr Malaysia, if you happen to be watching, I certainly hope that you have a rear-wheel drive long-range model available at some point for the media to review, because I feel like that is the model that I would more readily recommend. Because nobody needs 600 plus horsepower and 700 Newton meters of torque. What you want is a car that will comfortably do 550 kilometers on a charge and charge very quickly once you deplete the battery. And so I hope, fingers crossed, that Zeekr Malaysia does have one available, because that's the car I really want to review, because like I said, I think that represents where the majority of customers are spending their money, and I also think that that's where the real value is within the Zeekr 7X lineup. In any case, that concludes our review of the 2026 Zeekr 7X Performance. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon to notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the description below, including the link to join our new WhatsApp channel. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe, and jangan bodoh. Like all of these people who don't really know how to stay in their lane.